Ladies and gentlemen, it is with very great pride and pleasure that I welcome you here today on behalf of the UCLA Art Council and on behalf of Mrs. Richard Wolford, President, and Mrs. Robert Burton, in charge of this lectureship series given by the distinguished Dr. Erwin Panofsky. I especially want to extend a warm, however wet, welcome to my fellow students and to the visiting students and faculty from our sister campuses of the University of California. May I now present the chairman of our art department, Dr. Carl Birkmeyer.
Mrs. Ferris, ladies and gentlemen, you all know of the enormous achievements of Dr. Panofsky and of the unmeasurable effect his teaching and his writing has had and is having on all humanistic studies in the Western world. Those of you fortunate enough to hear his first lecture in this year's UCLA Art Council series last night, if you could get in, have realized, I am sure, that his talks are not just lectures or lessons, but truly are experiences. It is a great honor and a sheer delight to present to you again Dr. Panofsky, who speaks this afternoon on biblical and archaeological subjects in the work of Titian. Dr. Panofsky.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow students, this afternoon I wish to claim your attention to some problems connected with Titian's representations from the Bible and the legend of the saints. And such a discussion may fitly begin with his interpretation of that event, which is the root of all problems and at the same time the source of our ability to cope with them, and that is the fall of man. This fateful moment when Adam and Eve forfeited their innocence and immortality because they wanted to know is depicted in a painting now in the Prado, which was so much damaged by fire and so thoroughly repainted afterwards that it is no more than a magnificent ruin today. Completed quite late in Titian's career, probably between 1560 and 1570, it is generally believed to have been composed at a considerably earlier date. And its sources are indeed traceable to the first quarter of the century. One of these sources appears to be Raphael's Fall of Man in the Loggia of the Vatican. From it would seem Titian took over the idea of representing Adam seated while Eve is shown standing, a motif apparently intended to emphasize the more passive role of the male in the act of seduction. She took of the fruit thereof, as it says in the Bible, and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. In Titian's canvas, this genealogy of sin is made even more explicit than in the Vatican fresco. The fruit is being given to Eve by a human-headed serpent, I'm speaking of the left-hand picture, whose coils are so much concealed by and intertwined with the branches of the tree that its head evokes the impression of a Cupid en buste. Instead of being given by Eve to Adam, his gesture even expresses gentle rebuke rather than acceptance. The other source, I believe, was Dürer's engraving of 1504. It was under the influence of this world-famous print that Titian not only revised the posture of Eve, but also placed a particular emphasis on the symbolism of animals and plants. Dürer's Eve is accompanied by a rabbit and a cat, animals symbolizing two of the four humors whose balance in the human being was disturbed by the fatal bite. The rabbit stands for the sanguine temperament and sensuality, the cat for the choleric temperament and cruelty. Titian's Eve is accompanied by a fox. It's not very clear, but you can see it in the lower left-hand corner. The symbol of luxury and even more frequently of the devil himself. But near at hand in Titian's picture, there is an antidote. The beautifully painted hollyhock, which from Horace to the 16th century was credited with curative powers of all kinds and could even be used as a symbol of salvation. It's on the right hand, in the right hand part of the picture. Dürer's engraving also contains an antidote, the parrot, perched on a branch of the tree of life, a mountain ash, to which Adam holds on with his right hand. For a very curious reason, the Middle Ages had accepted the parrot as a symbol of the virgin birth of Christ. When young Julius Caesar rode through a forest, a parrot allegedly addressed him with the words, Ave Caesar. And this was taken not only as proof of the possibility of miracles, but also as an allusion to the angelic salutation, Ave Maria, which proclaims the Virgin Mary as the new Eve, or Nova Eva, by the very fact that Eva, read backwards, is Ave. Titian omitted the parrot. But Rubens, to whom we owe an excellent copy of Titian's canvas, inserted it precisely where it is in Dürer's print. Since it is very improbable that Rubens made this insertion only because he wanted a spot of red to balance the hollyhock, this effect he would have obtained just as easily in other ways. We may assume that Rubens had realized the connection which exists between Titian's painting and Dürer's engraving, and in a sense paid homage to Dürer while improving Titian. Titian also alluded to the interpretation of the Virgin Mary as the new Eve who blots out the transgression of the old one in an Annunciation, which can still be admired where it had been since at least 1555, the Scuola di San Rocco in Venice. Probably executed in the latter half of the 30s, it rather resembles, from a purely compositional point of view, the presentation of the Virgin in the Accademia and the Venus of Urbino in the Uffizi. In spite of the agitated movement of the angel Gabriel, the field is almost schematically divided by verticals and horizontals. Here too, we have two axes of symmetry, one formed by the farther edge of the colonnade, the colonnade in the center, the other by the upper edge of the parapet. And here too our attention is attracted by a kind of still life, placed apparently as an afterthought, since the tiles of the floor are showing through the paint at the base of the Virgin's prie-dieu. Yeah. There we observe a work basket an apple, a fig leaf, and a bird, which is often referred to as a guinea hen, faraona in Italian, but as ornithologists assure me, is in reality a red-legged partridge, Alectoris rufa. The work basket, like the even older spindle, characterizes the annunciate as one of the virgins entrusted with the task of producing a new curtain for the Temple of Jerusalem. The apple and the fig leaf, however, clearly allude to her role as Nova Eva, and the partridge could symbolize the incarnation itself. The female partridge was believed to conceive by the mere wind that had passed the male partridge, or even by the latter's mating call. The fact that the Virgin conceived by the Holy Spirit could thus be illustrated by a partridge bearing the motto afflatu fecunda, fruitful by a breath of air. And since the Virgin Mary, through the angelic salutation, conceived by the ear, que per aurem concepisti, the partridge could visualize the phrase audita voce fecunda, fruitful by hearing a voice. Apart from a few lost or doubtful pictures, Titian had only one other occasion to deal with scenes from the Old Testament. In 3 large pictures, originally adorning the ceiling of Santo Spirito in Isola, the church of the Augustinian canons, situated on a tiny island in the Laguna Viva, transferred to the greater sacristy of Santa Maria della Salute after the suppression of the order in 1656. These 3 pictures, which are here combined in one slide, represent the slaying of Abel, the sacrifice of Isaac, and the triumph of Goliath, David over Goliath. I enumerate them from bottom to top. The pictures had been commissioned to, but not executed by, Vasari in 1541, and were speedily carried out by Titian in the following year. At the end of 1544, he and the canons were already involved in the lawsuit for payment. This triad shows Titian caught in a whirlpool of conflicting influences. A classical sarcophagus, Pordenone's frescoes, in Santo Stefano in Venice, Correggio's decoration of the dome of San Giovanni Evangelista at Parma, possibly even a fresco of the 14th century. From all this resulted, on the one hand, an atypical intensification of the emotions, as when Cain continues to attack his brother, already felled and bleeding, with a ferocity more cruel than Nero's. That's the picture now on the right. When the tragic resolve of Abraham is contrasted with the touching submission of a childlike Isaac, or when the horrible and terrifying bulk of Goliath serves as a foil for the devout abandon of a diminutive David. On the other hand, we can observe an equally atypical predominance of bold foreshortenings Well, I'm sorry I have no light. Of bold foreshortenings and the de Soto in Su perspective, which, as demonstrated by parallel cases, cannot be explained by the mere fact that the pictures originally decorated a ceiling. Their present arrangement in the sacristy of Santa Maria della Salute follows the sequence of events as told in the Bible. The slaying of Abel, Genesis 4, the sacrifice of Isaac, Genesis 22, the triumph of David, 1 Samuel 17. And the shape of the huge oblong room, accessible only through a door in one of its longer walls, made it necessary to display the three pictures side by side, videlicet from left to right, not as they are arranged here, one on top of the other. But in Santo Spirito, for which they were originally painted, a longitudinal church of modest dimensions, their sequence must be supposed to have proceeded from front to back rather than from left to right. But here a curious difficulty presents itself. With only one exception, those writers who saw the three pictures before their transfer to Santa Maria della Salute are unanimous in listing the sacrifice of Isaac at the beginning and in placing the triumph of David in the middle between the two other panels. Since it is unlikely that authors living in Venice simply copied Vasari, who may have been in error, we have no right to disregard their testimony. But the sequence recorded by them is not only at variance with the biblical chronology, but also would have been unsatisfactory from an artistic point of view. And I am inclined to believe that the sequence intended by Titian, who we recall fell out with the canons of Santo Spirito as soon as the paintings were completed, and may have refused to supervise their mise en place in person, was precisely as it is now. The error then seems to have been committed when the paintings were installed in Santo Spirito, and to have been rectified when they were transferred to Santa Maria della Salute, with the only difference that, as I said before, the pictures were originally intended to be placed on a vertical rather than a horizontal axis. Read in this order, that is to say the order in which they present themselves to you here, the three compositions would have found a meaningful pattern. The slaying of Abel dominated by a diagonal that runs from lower left to upper right. The sacrifice of Isaac by a diagonal that runs from lower right to upper left. The triumph of David, finally, by a less sharply inclined diagonal that starts on the lower left but terminates not at the upper right but in a central apex formed by a radiance of divine light between two nearly balanced masses of clouds. And the glance of the beholder would have been guided from the dark earth, polluted by the first crime, to an effulgent heaven opening up before his very eyes. From an iconographical point of view, the series may indeed be called a trilogy of homicide. Homicide condemned by God, homicide prevented by God, and homicide approved by God. But at the same time, the three scenes are invested, I believe, with the Christological significance. Abel, the keeper of sheep, foreshadows the shepherd of men, as St. Augustine puts it. Isaac, and most particularly David, were all considered prefigurations of Christ, and the specific events represented in Titian's picture were held to stand for Christ's passion at the hands of his brethren, the Jews, for his willingness to accept the passion, and for his triumph over the devil. In Abel, says Paulinus of Nola, Christ was killed by his brother. In Isaac, he was offered as a sacrifice. And that David slew Goliath signifies Christ, who slew the devil because humility triumphs over pride. Thus, Titian's triad may be read as an allusion, as the early theologians would say, mystical representation of Christ, the victim, Christ, the instrument of redemption, Christus Oblatus, and Christ, the conqueror of evil, Christus Triumphans. And it is only with this allusive significance in mind that we can fully appreciate Titian's novel interpretation of David's victory. Ostensibly, and this in itself is, so far as I know, unprecedented, David offers a prayer of thanks to God after having beheaded Goliath. But the way in which he rushes forward and upward gives the impression of both an intercession and an ascension, detaching and, as it were, liberating himself from the inert, earthbound mass of the prostrate colossus, whose head is severed but still in place. He appears to be imploring as well as thanking the deity, and he seems to rise to heaven, a heaven which quite literally opens itself before his and the beholder's eyes by the sheer force of faith. It is almost symbolic that the figure of Goliath, usually as required by 1 Samuel 17, represented fallen upon his face to the earth, is here patterned after a sinner from pagan antiquity. Here on your slide, the slain Aegisthus in an Orestes sarcophagus, which was to haunt Titian's imagination for nearly half a century. The gesture of the praying David, on the other hand, his arms ecstatically raised and joined above his head, is anticipated by that of a Christian saint offering prayers as well as thanks for delivery. That is the St. George saved from the wheel in Altichiero's fresco in the Oratorio di San Giorgio at Padua, which Titian knew so well from the sojourn there about 30 years before he painted the pictures. The idea that the series, now in Santa Maria della Salute, reveals some influence of Correggio finds support in the nearly contemporary St. John on Patmos, now in the National Gallery at Washington. It's on your left side. It seems to reflect Correggio's portrayal of the same saint in San Giovanni Evangelista in Parma on your right side, and its iconography is not so vague or arbitrary as would appear from previous discussions. St. John's visionary experience on Patmos begins, it will be remembered, with a vision in which he sees 7 golden candlesticks and in their midst one like the Son of Man. It is this scene with which most artists, including Dürer, opened their illustration of Apocalypse. But Titian's imagination was fired, it seems, by the preceding versicles of the text, where St. John hears but does not as yet see the awesome apparition. I saw in the Spirit and heard behind me a great voice as a trumpet, and I turned to see the voice that spake to me. Beautiful phrase, I turned to see the voice that spake to me. It is the choice of this pregnant moment prior to the actual seeing which accounts for the contorted movement of the startled visionary. With this, if one may say so, auditory vision of St. John, we have entered the world of the New Testament, but we have entered it by the back door rather than the front door. Chronologically, the earliest incident from the era under grace, narrated by Titian, and in fact preceding the actual inception of this era by several years, is the presentation of the Virgin already shown. That colossal canvas, which can still be seen in the room for which it was painted, the guest house of the Scuola della Carità, now incorporated in the Accademia. Its composition, we remember, is governed by the same tendencies as the contemporaneous Venus of Urbino in the Uffizi and the Annunciation, already shown in the Scuola di San Rocco. Rectangular schematization and isolability of genre features. In the presentation, however, Titian was handicapped by three difficulties. He had to display more architectural perspective than was his custom and suited his inclinations. He had to tag on to the principal scene a kind of Dutch group portrait, showing the governing body of the distinguished confraternity which had commissioned the pictures. This is this whole group on the left-hand margin. As he had to put then, and this is the most important thing, he had to put up with a rectangular gap in the lower right-hand corner, which is a real doorway, which in contrast to that on the left was already in existence when the picture was painted and had to be reckoned with. To overcome the first and second of these difficulties, Titian revised his inconspicuous model, Cima da Conegliano's charming little, this I showed only to show that there are still life features or genre features which can easily be isolated. Now this is Titian's model, Cima da Conegliano's charming little presentation of the Virgin in the Gemälde Gallery at Dresden, according to the principle, and he revised this according to the principles laid down in the stage designs of his good friend Sebastiano Serlio, who in turn was a student of Baldassare Piruzzi, the great genius of theatrical art and decoration in the 16th century. This is the famous presentation of Christ on the right-hand slide, the presentation of the Virgin by Piruzzi in Santa Maria della Pace in Rome. And it is this kind of thing which served as a model to Titian when he revised the composition of his presentation of the Virgin. The group portrait on the left was connected with, yet separated from, the central event by the insertion of a figure seen from the rear, which advances towards the right while looking back to the left. The third problem of Titian was solved by the ingenious idea of incorporating the doorway belonging to the actual architecture of the Scuola della Carità with the painted architecture of the Temple of Jerusalem. Titian surrounded it with a simulated framework of blocks forming doorposts at the sides and a straight arch on top. I'm speaking of the right-hand doorway. The segments of dead wall were enlivened by two strange figures, the repulsive old egg woman on the left and the headless torso of a Roman armored, here unfortunately not visible, of a Roman armored statue on the right. These two motifs, the Roman statue and the egg woman, are obvious space fillers, but hardly without significance. It has been proposed to interpret the egg woman as a personification of nature and the Roman torso as a personification of art. But there would have been no reason to include these two personifications more suitable for the frontispiece of an art theoretical treatise in a presentation of the Virgin. Another, possibly more convincing explanation is suggested by Dürer's woodcut. B81, representing the same subject, namely the presentation of the Virgin, and particularly well known in Italy because the series to which it belongs, that is Dürer's Life of the Virgin, had been copied by Marcantonio, an Italian artist, as early as 1506. In this woodcut, a significant contrast exists between a pagan idol placed on top of the arch in the upper right-hand corner and a group of Jewish merchants placed in the lower left-hand corner, who sell the offerings required by Jewish law and custom, much as candles are sold at the door of a Catholic church today: lambs, small loaves of showbread, and turtle doves. What is alluded to is, in this woodcut, the time-honored contrast between paganism and Judaism, both to be conquered by Christianity. The idea of Judaism is already implied by the less grandly horrifying prototype of Titian's egg woman, the charming farmer's wife in Schima's presentation, which we have just seen, who analogously placed and apparently characterized as Jewish by the costumes of her companions, still sells bread and turtle doves in
The sound, we can't hear you now, so he's going to fix it.
Yeah, there was a funny thing, but I have done nothing.
No, I know, but it's just in the last sentence that the sound went off.
Yeah. Do you think it's in order now?
Is it? Yes.
Well, I'm very sorry. Since when did this trouble start? In other words, how much of the lecture did you not hear? What?
Ending with the turtle dove.
Ending with the turtle dove. Well, I was saying that the model of Titian's egg woman is still there and is already there and already Jewish in Cimada Conegliano's little picture. But here, she sells not only eggs unconnected with even the Jewish rite and ritual, but in addition, she sells turtle doves, which were required by the Bible. In placing the egg woman and the Roman torso outside the picture space proper, Titian excluded them in a purely physical way from the sacred event that takes place within the temple, in indicating the era ante legem by a mere torso. He made the beholder aware that Greek and Roman paganism were no longer a problem, whereas Judaism was still very much alive. And in replacing merchants who, though bent on profit, sell things required by the cult, with an old hag selling nothing but eggs, unrelated to even the Jewish ritual, he produced the symbol of a mentality not only unenlightened, but incapable of ever seeing the light, the spirit of those of whom the evangelist says that God had blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts. Of all the other representations of subjects from the New Testament, I shall discuss only two. One, because it still tends to be misinterpreted. The other, because it confronts us with what seems to be an anachronism involving more than 300 years. The first of these two pictures is an altarpiece, impressive in spite of the fact that it was carried out with the help of assistants, which in 1554 was donated by Titian to the collegiate church of Medole near Mantua, where it still is. It shows a dialogue between the risen Christ and his mother, who is shown kneeling before him. She is alone, but he is accompanied by some of the patriarchs whom he had freed from purgatory before his resurrection: Adam, Eve, Noah, and Abraham. In the special literature on Titian, so far as I know it, the Medole altarpiece is always described as Christ's appearance to his mother, and while a very competent article devoted to the iconography of this subject acknowledges the uniqueness of Titian's composition, it does not specify its theological content. That Christ appeared to the Virgin Mary after his death is not recorded in the Bible. But from the earliest times it was taken for granted that here, before appearing to so many others, must have appeared to his own mother. He was believed either to have shown himself to her near the sepulchre on Easter morning, or more frequently in Western art, to have visited her after his descent into limbo in her house on the Sabbath between the Friday of the crucifixion and the Sunday of the resurrection. In rendering this unrecorded encounter, most artists patterned the scene either after the Noli Me Tangere, the Virgin Mary kneeling before and facing her son in an outdoor setting, or after the Annunciation, the Virgin Mary surprised by his appearance while reading or praying in the privacy of her room. And this applies even where Christ, having redeemed the patriarchs from purgatory, appears in their company, as in this Spanish 15th century picture, which is now in Williamstown in New England. Titian, however, transposed the scene to heaven. While he retains what may be called the Noli Me Tangere scheme, he shows the two figures surrounded by angels and supported by clouds. In making this unique innovation, Titian, apparently advised by the theologians, the canons of Medole, defined the correct solution of a major theological dispute which had come to a head at this time. Ever since, the members of the Carmelite order had adopted the style and title of Fratres Beatae Mariae Virginis and begun to wear a special scapula to ensure their protection. They had been spreading the belief that the Virgin Mary would descend into purgatory on the Saturday after the death of Christ in order personally to liberate her votaries, especially if he was a member of the Carmelite order. This belief formalized in a faked papal bull known as Bulla Sabbatina, the bull pertaining to the Easter Sabbath, was untenable from a theological point of view, since only Christ himself has the power of redemption. Yet it had taken root so firmly that from 1577 a series of genuine papal bulls had to acknowledge this belief precisely by restricting it to acceptable limits. While the Virgin was denied the power to redeem in person, she was credited, as she still is in the section De Ecclesia adopted by the Vatican Council of 1964, with the office of assisting the souls of the deceased by her perpetual intercession, pious prayer, and special protection. It is this perpetual intercession for the souls of the deceased, performed of course in heaven rather than in purgatory or on earth, which is the true subject of Titian's Medole altarpiece. But so closely did Titian keep to the traditional way of representing Christ appearing to his mother in the company of the redeemed patriarchs, that his composition could serve as a model for the most beautiful of these visualizations of the spurious Bulla Sabbatina, which, all objections notwithstanding, sprang up by 1580 and shows the perpetual intercession in limbo rather than in heaven. Guido Reni's Dresden harrowing of hell in the presence of the Virgin Mary, here on the screen but hardly visible, I'm afraid, could hardly have been produced without the influence, direct or indirect, of Titian's Maederle altarpiece. In contrast to this altarpiece, the other picture I should like to discuss is a much earlier and less ambitious work, a characteristic product of Titian's first phase, when he had not as yet disengaged himself from the influence of Giorgione and Leonardo, but had already developed a style of his own and particularly an unparalleled ability to interpret the human glance or eye as the window of the soul. That is the Salome in the Galleria Doria Pamphili at Rome. Salome carrying the charger with the head of the Baptist is shown in front of a piece of masonry which, as indicated by a lock, represents the saint's prison and is somewhat mysteriously connected with the frontal wall pierced by an arch. Meditative and a little benumbed, Salome seems to recoil from the face of St. John, which yet attracts her sidelong glance with irresistible force. A handmaiden looks at the heroine with the eyes of a faithful dog who feels and shares his master's distress without comprehending its cause. It is a very sensuous picture. Note, for example, how the locks of the Baptist are brought into direct contact with the bare forearm of Salome, and this sensuousness seems to be fraught with personal connotations. It has been conjectured that the saint's face bears Titian's own features, and though we can compare it only with portraits made about half a century later, I am inclined to accept this hypothesis. The apparent age of the Baptist agrees with Titian's presumable age at the time when the picture was painted, and in all those traits which tend to remain constant in a human countenance, the curve of the forehead, the conformation of the cheekbones, the arch of the eyebrows, the thin aquiline shape of the nose, the picture anticipates the late self-portraits, particularly that in the Prado, to a surprising degree. If this interpretation ad hominem were admitted, Titian's Salome would be the earliest example of those self-portraits en décapité, in which a love-stricken painter lent his own features to either Holofernes, as is the case with Cristofano Allori's famous Judith in the Pitti Palace, which was so much admired by Balzac, and where the Judith is portrayed in the guise of Cristofano Allori's rather domineering mistress called La Mazzafera, or it may be compared to the Goliath in the case of Caravaggio's David in the Galleria Borghese, where other inclinations hold sway in the soul of the painter. But even if this explanation were to be rejected, the amorous implications of Titian's Salome are attested by the little Cupid, which is perched, here very difficult to recognize, on the apex of the arch like a kind of human keystone. The idea of Salome's erotic involvement with John the Baptist is generally considered a romantic invention of the 19th century, popularized by Heinrich Heine, Oscar Wilde, Aubrey Beardsley, and Richard Strauss. By and large, this view, formerly shared by myself, is not without justification. But there existed a kind of underground tradition which anticipated the modern interpretation by more than 7 centuries. The Gospels mention the daughter of Herodias, and therefore stepdaughter of Herod the second Antipas, only as the damsel. It is in Flavius Josephus' Jewish Antiquities that the name Salome occurs for the first time, and with very rare exceptions. For example, a little-known father of the church named Isidore of Pelusium. The Christian writers were always very reluctant to adopt it. They either continued to leave her anonymous, or, thanks to a confusion dating back as far as Origen, bestowed upon her the name of her mother, Herodias. According to the Gospels, this damsel, that's how she is called there, is a mere tool in the hands of her wicked mother. It is the latter who, enraged by the Baptist's censure of her incestuous marriage to Herod, instructs her daughter to ask for the Baptist's head as a reward for dancing at Herod's birthday party. There is no implication of love except for Herod's obvious infatuation with his stepdaughter, cleverly exploited by his wife. And it is only as an accomplice malgré elle, light-hearted rather than malevolent, that Salome becomes a victim of divine retribution in later legends. According to one of these later legends, she was herself decapitated by the ice on which she was walking and which broke under her. According to another, she was blown into the sky by a blast of air, miraculously rushing forth from the mouth of the Baptist's head after his decapitation. This weird annunciation secured for Salome, still commonly referred to as Herodias, but unequivocally identified as the virginal daughter of her wicked mother and as an incomparable dancer, a place not only in medieval demonology, but also, curiously enough, in medieval hagiology. She was equated with the old Germanic storm goddess Frau Holle, Fru Helle or Fru Helde, and thus acquired a permanent position in the wilde Jagd, the wild hunt that rides the clouds by night. And in this capacity, she is said to have been worshipped by 1/3 of all mankind. But owing to the fortuitous assonance between Fru Helle or Fru Helde and the Flemish name Verilde or Verelde, she also seems to have come to be identified with a bona fide saint, Saint Verelde, Pfarrer Hildes in Latin, one of the city patrons of Ghent. It was, ironically, a canon of Saint Pfarrer Hildes in Ghent itself, named Nivardus, who in the early 12th century not only identified the patroness of his own church with the stepdaughter of Herod, but also transformed the biblical account of the death of St. John into a love story. Salome, he tells us, was madly in love with the Baptist and vowed not to marry any other man. It is out of resentment that Herod orders the execution of St. John, and out of amorous despair that Salome requests his head. She embraces it, now this is all literally after Nivardus, she embraces it with her soft arms, drenches it with tears, and attempts to kiss it. But the head shies away from her and sends her up into the air. Pursued by the spirit of him who had refused to reciprocate her love, she suffers for a long time, comforted only by the veneration of millions. But ultimately, perhaps because she, like the genuine Farahildes, had been faithful to a vow of virginity, she comes to be revered as a saint. Now known as Farahildes, once Herodias, unrivaled as a dancer now and evermore. This highly unorthodox version of the Salome story, compounded of folkloristic superstition, the salve applied by witches before they rise into the air, used to be called unguentum faraelis, sacred legend and romance, could never find official recognition. It left its mark on popular songs, sung on the day of St. John, and on the customs practiced on his feast, that is to say, Midsummer Day, but there seems to be no further trace of it in literature until Jacob Grimm printed the tale of Nivardus in his German mythology, published in 1835, whence it passed into Heine's Attertroll, 1841, and thence into the art and literature of the fin de siècle. Yet, as Heine rightly says, in der Bibel steht es nicht, doch im Volke lebt die Sage von Herodias blutiger Liebe. This is not found in the Bible, but the people know the legend of Herodias bloody love. In some way or other, this underground version of the Salome theme must have persisted throughout the centuries. It was revived by Titian, and that it was still remembered in the 17th century is evident from at least two pictures. The more interesting of these is a beautiful Guercino in the collection of Mr. Dennis Mann in London, which represents Salome visiting St. John in prison before its execution. Gorgeously attired, the love-stricken princess yearningly looks through the window of the Baptist's cell, clutching its bars with her left hand, while he turns disdainfully away from her enraptured glance. But he is clearly identified as John the Baptist by the coat of camel's hair which he wears beneath his overcoat. In tracing the strange, eventful history of the Salome legend, we have been led from the orbit of the New Testament into that of hagiology. The earliest of Titian works in this domain, that is the representation of saints, is a cycle of 3 frescoes in the Scuola del Santo at Padua, executed quite early in Titian's career between December 1510 and December 1511. This cycle represents 3 miracles of St. Anthony. We have first the justification of a wife, that's there on the left-hand side, wrongly accused of adultery. The saint endows her newborn son with speech and thus enables him to testify, as it were, to his own legitimacy. The second miracle involves the healing of a young man, that's on the right-hand side, who, having kicked his mother with his foot, had subsequently repented and hacked it off in contrition. Finally, there is the revival of an innocent wife stabbed by her husband in a fit of jealousy and brought back to life by the saint after the husband repented. In 2 cases, the miracle of the speaking infant and the miracle of the obstreperous son, Titian's frescoes deal with the same subject as Donatello's famous reliefs on the high altar of St. Anthony's Church, affectionately known as the Santo in Padua. but Titian wisely refrained from courting comparison. He pursued, so to speak, a policy of non-recognition, and it was in deference to Mantegna and to Giotto, rather than under the influence of Donatello, that he adopted a closely packed, isocephalous arrangement of the figures in front of instead of within the pictorial space. This basic independence of Donatello is also exemplified by the fresco which I have singled out for discussion, The Miracle of the Newborn Infant. Donatello's interpretation of this scene on your right is almost classicistic in modeling, costume and posture, although he combines the three protagonists, the saint, the mother and the child, into a group not unlike a presentation of Christ. In Titian's mural, nearly all the actors are dressed in contemporary garb, a feature particularly conspicuous in the figures of the mother and the young father, who storms upon the scene with a truly magnificent sweep of his cape. And a long-distance relationship is established between the mother on the one hand and the saint and child group on the other. All the more remarkable is the fact that whereas in Donatello's classicizing relief, the miracle takes place under the protection of the Madonna, in Titian's very modern fresco, the scene is dominated by the slightly mutilated statue of a Roman emperor. As is usual with Titian's first phase, this statue is still an incidental feature of the mise en scène. Yet he must have had a reason to include it in the representation of a miracle worked by a saint, perfectly historical, who had died in 1231 AD. All the more so as no comparable feature can be discovered in the two other scenes. The very uniqueness of the motif of the emperor's statue, however, may provide the clue for its interpretation. The miracle of the newborn infant is the only of the three incidents which has an official and legal rather than a private and emotional character. It involves a formal accusation of a woman charged with adultery and her equally formal vindication. Now we know, and so did Titian, that it was a universal Roman custom to place a statue of the reigning emperor in every tribunal, much as a portrait of the reigning king or queen of England is found in every courtroom in the British Commonwealth. For, as Severian puts it, the emperor, since he is a human being, cannot be present everywhere, and therefore an image of him must be erected in every place where his representative dispenses justice, so that this image might validate whichever action is being taken. The Apology of Apuleius, widely read in the Renaissance, contains a passage which may well be Titian's direct source. In it, there is involved also an accusation of adultery and the testimony of the accused sons before the statue of the emperor. Titian's emperor statue then defines the locale of the narrative as what had been a place of judgment from times immemorial. Padua was proud of its descent from the Roman Patavium, the birthplace of Livy, but with an inversion in bonam partem, frequently found in the Christianization of pagan motifs. An adult son accusing his mother of adultery in front of the emperor's image has been replaced by a small child exonerating his mother in the same setting. And while in pagan times the emperor's statue had embodied the idea of a terrestrian but infallible justice, against which there can be no appeal, the emperor's statue in Titian's fresco embodies the idea of a terrestrial and fallible justice, hence probably the slightly fragmented state of the image, whose verdicts can be nullified by the miraculous intervention of God and his saints. Some 40 years after his return from Padua, to be exact, on October 11, 1552, Titian dispatched to Philip II, together with some other pictures, a portrayal of Saint Margaret, which is now preserved in the Escorial. And after still another 12 or 13 years, about 1565, he revised this composition in one of his ultimate productions, the wonderful Saint Margaret, now in the Prado. That these two pictures have survived gives us a chance to compare a late with an even later interpretation of the same subject. Even in 1552, left-hand picture, Titian's style had not as yet achieved that coincidence of opposites, abundance and discipline, passion and severity, which distinguishes the Saint Margaret of circa 1565 from her more elastic and more sinuous ancestress. Only in the later picture did he reverse the normal color relations to such an extent that a figure clad in a moss green dress is set out against the landscape, painted in all imaginable shades of brown and red without a trace of green. Yet the two pictures bear witness to Titian's enduring loyalty to certain basic experiences which stayed with him, so to speak, throughout his career. At the beginning of the 40s, we remember the passive element of a classical Orestes sarcophagus. The slain Aegisthus had furnished the model for the slain Goliath, which we have contemplated today. But 20 years before that, shortly after 1520, the active element in the same composition, the contrapposto movement of the avenging Orestes, had inspired what John Keats was to call the swift bound of Bacchus, when he leaps from his chariot to rejoin Ariadne in a mortal and immortalizing embrace. And it is still the same Orestes who, in a final transfiguration, recurs in the two Margarets. To re-employ this posture for Saint Margaret was not entirely unjustified. Saint Margaret, too, performs a swift bound. She steps forth from the belly of a dragon which had swallowed her. But by the power of the cross, the monster was forced to burst and to release her, in many renderings still gripping the garment with its teeth. It is probably thanks to this legend that Saint Margaret was and is venerated as the special patroness of childbirth. But the legend itself has resulted from an old and ineradicable confusion between Saint Margaret, of whom originally no more was known than that she was the daughter of a priest at Antioch, martyred under Diocletian, and an entirely different saint who shares with Saint Margaret only her involvement with a dragon-like monster and the first three letters of her name, Saint Martha, sister of Lazarus and Mary Magdalene. These three were believed to have fled the Holy Land by ship and to have spent the rest of their lives in the south of France. The Magdalene was supposed to have died in Aix-en-Provence, or according to another source, in a cave in the Chaîne de la Sainte-Baume, not far from Marseille, Saint Lazarus in Autun, and St. Martha in Tarascon. The difference between the two saints is this. St. Margaret came to grips with her dragon while she was in prison, and the means by which she caused its destruction was to make the sign of the cross. St. Martha, on the other hand, courageously approached her dragon, called Tarasca in Latin and La Tarasque in French, in its own lair, in the woods near Tarascon, whence it terrorized the whole valley of the Rhone. She sprinkled it with holy water, hypnotized it by means of a little wooden cross, bound it with her own girdle, and led it like a tame dog to a place where a group of determined citizens could finish it. These two legends fused at an early date, certainly long before 1300. And St. Margaret, much better known and more widely venerated than St. Martha, tended to absorb a number of features originally belonging to the latter and not to herself. The situation was further complicated by the fact that St. Margaret was often identified with the Cappadocian princess, delivered from still another dragon by St. George, and it is often difficult to determine which of the three saints is meant in a given work of art. In countless representations, the delivery of St. Margaret is staged in the open air instead of in prison. She often appropriates not only St. Martha's little wooden cross, but also her girdle, and she tends to be closely associated with St. George. In a procession held at Antwerp in 1520, for example, Albrecht Dürer admired a beautiful girl who, impersonating St. Margaret, led a dragon by her belt and was followed by a very handsome cuirassier impersonating St. George. Written at Avignon in the Rhone Valley in 1337, on the other hand, it is St. Martha who legitimately leads her monster, here explicitly inscribed Tarasca, and interpreted as a symbol of hypocrisy, by her belt, and brandishes her little cross, which is lawfully hers. But partially protruding from the monster's mouth, there appears none other than St. Margaret, identified as Christianity devoured in the likeness of St. Margaret. Christianitas devorator similitudine Margarita. Titian's letter fortunately leaves no doubt that we are confronted with St. Margaret in the Escorial as well as in the Prado rendering. In both cases, Titian accepted the then traditional transfer of the open-air setting and the little wooden cross from St. Martha to St. Margaret. But in the Prado version, he introduced two innovations. May I have the other St. Margaret on the left? Yeah. In both cases, as I said, Titian accepted the traditional transfer of the open-air setting and the little wooden cross from St. Martha to St. Margaret. But in the Prado version, he introduced two innovations. First, he added a skull in the lower right-hand corner, a feature taken over from renderings of St. George slaying the dragon in the vicinity of the dragon's cave, where the remains of former victims are very much in evidence. Secondly, and more importantly, he included a burning city in the background, in the right-hand picture. This unparalleled motif, unrelated to both the legend of St. Margaret and the legend of St. George, can be explained only by a new borrowing from the legend of St. Martha, according to which her dragon, the Tarasque, not content with devouring men and beasts, indulged in the devastation of whole villages and towns in the Rhone Valley. How grateful Titian must have been for an excuse thus to enhance the warm glow of his greenless landscape by the weird splendor of a conflagration. Thank you.